Locate your phone, huh? All right, I think we're on. Go ahead.
Welcome once again, everyone, to the Anderson Law Power Hour with attorney Tim Anderson. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the author and guest. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Also, there is no attorney-client privilege. Feel free to ask questions or comment here with us live on Facebook. Legal consultation services will be determined at the time of your appointment. Anderson Law is a firm located here in Virginia Beach, 2492 North Landing Road, Suite 104. Online today, virginialawoffice.com. virginialawoffice.com. If you'd like to call, here's the number, 757-800-1000. 757-800-1000. I'm Mark Rollison. As always, we welcome you to join us for our podcast here with attorney Tim Anderson. I got to get my applause thing in here somehow. All right.
Yeah, all the people are...
the audiences.
All right. I think we're on Facebook. I know some people are watching. Go ahead and if the people are watching, if you could just send a quick comment on here to make sure the sound is good.
Yep.
I think we are live. So what we're going to talk about today is universal background checks. And what I put on Facebook is I said, let me explain it to you. Let's have an honest conversation about it.
Yeah.
And then you make the decision as to whether or not it is the right thing to do. Right?
There are a myriad of opinions and ideas from both sides, those who are opposed to it for various reasons and those who do find, as I have in some basic research, it is a viable means for reducing gun-related violence in some instances.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So we're getting a comment that broadcast is coming over sideways, so let me try to adjust this.
Appreciate that.
And thank you, Facebook, for letting us know that it was broadcasting the wrong way. That helps out quite a bit. All right, so.
Universal background checks.
Universal background checks. Sorry,
That's
Facebook, we're gonna have a little bit of an adjustment here to make this work. All right.
All right.
I think we're almost there. All right, this is what happens when you
go live
and working out a couple of the kinks. So let's see, we got you in there, Mark. There we go. All right, very good. Sorry about that, Facebook. All right, here we go. So back to universal background checks. So what are they? First of all, let's talk about that. The Gun Control Act of 1968, which is the first gun control laws that really became federal in the United States, talk to us generally about how a federal dealer can sell guns, right? And it may surprise a lot of people that it really wasn't until the 90s that we had a background check.
That's correct, 1991, I believe.
Yeah, in that time period. So it was the Brady Handgun Violence Protection Act. So before 1993, there was really no federal background situations. And so what we're talking about moving forward from then is in the early 1990s, the Brady Handgun Violence Protection Act went in, which said that federal dealers have to do a background check when they're selling guns. And really before then, that didn't apply.
Right.
All right. So then it goes to the next part of the equation, which is after I lawfully purchase a firearm from a dealer, if I want to sell that firearm, say to you, what is the federal regulations on that, right? And so that's what the universal background check basically is talking about. It's talking about me being able to sell by a private party transaction, me to sell you a gun, all right? So the ATF has something called the Best Practices Act. If you can see this on Facebook. It talks about what the general requirements are to sell firearms.
Oh, that's great to know. Okay.
Sell firearms between two people. Now, believe it or not, it's a federal regulation that is only one page. So that's pretty amazing in and of itself. But essentially, what it says is that an unlicensed firearm or an unlicensed individual may sell a firearm to another unlicensed individual, provided that they are the resident of the same state, and the seller has no reason to believe that the buyer is prohibited by law from possessing a firearm. Okay, so you have to really understand what the law says here as far as the federal government's concerned is that if I'm selling you a gun to private parties, I just can't have any reason to believe that you're a prohibited person.
Okay.
So let's talk about the general people that are prohibited. Now this is found in the United States Code, Title 18, Section 922. And we go to Section G. And here are people that are prohibited under federal rules from owning or possessing a firearm. They include someone who is a convicted felon, someone who may be a fugitive from justice, someone who is an unlawful user or addicted to a controlled substance, someone who's been adjudicated mentally defective or been committed to a mental institution, an illegal alien, someone who's been discharged from the armed forces under dishonorable conditions, someone who has renounced their U.S. citizenship, someone who has a protective order against them, or someone who's been convicted of misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. All right, so when we're talking about these types of people that are prohibited under federal rules, Mark, if I look at you, how would I know if you've ever renounced your citizenship?
Never. You never know that. No.
I mean, there's no way to know that, right? There's no way to know that, and there's no way to know if you're a convicted felon.
Right.
There's no way to know if you're even lawfully in the United States. I mean, I can't look at you and make those determinations. Right. And so when you come into a gun shop and you purchase a firearm,
right,
and we do an instant background check, essentially what we're doing is we're plugging your information into a database, and then the state and the federal government comes back and says very quickly, Mark can purchase a firearm or Mark can't purchase a firearm. And then when I say very quickly, the general side of it is about 120 seconds.
Okay, that's good. I was going to ask, how long does it take?
Yeah, I mean, that's the average. Now, I mean, some people do take longer, and that is well known. But I'm just looking at a couple of. All right, good. Yeah, good. So everybody says they can hear us. Good. All right. So about 120 seconds to do a federal background check, and in 120 seconds, the government, by checking their databases, will tell the gun dealer if you are one of these prohibited parties. So if you've been convicted of a domestic violence case out in Utah, we're going to know about it in Virginia. If you've been, if you were discharged from the military 18 years ago dishonorably, we're going to know about that. If you were put into a mental hospital 10 years ago, we're going to know about that by going through this background check, right? So, what the federal law says is I can sell you the gun so long as I don't have any reason to believe you are one of these prohibited parties. So as a private seller, it doesn't behoove me at all to ask you any of those questions, right? So if I said, hey, Joe, are you a convicted felon? And Joe says, yes, I am, and then I sell him the gun, then I can get in trouble for that. And obviously Joe can get in trouble for that.
At a gun show?
Anywhere.
Okay.
So if me as a private seller knows the buyer is a prohibited person, I can get in trouble. But normally, the buyer and the seller don't have those conversations.
True.
And even if they did, the seller doesn't have any way of verifying what the buyer is saying to be true. And unless there's some other real reason to believe it, I can sell it. So if I sell Joe a firearm privately, just two people, and I say, hey, Joe, are you a convicted felon? Just making sure. And he says no. I don't have any other reason to believe that he's a convicted felon. So those are the, those are the general rules about how private party transactions work. And so what the universal background check basically does is it says any time a gun goes from one entity to another or one party to another, a background check has to be conducted, all right? Whether it's private party, whether it's a gift, whether it's an inheritance. Whenever a firearm leaves Tim Anderson's hands and goes to Joe Smith's hands, Joe Smith has to go through a background check. That's the concept of universal background check.
That's the goal, essentially.
That's what they want to impose.
Yeah. Can I back up for a second, sir?
Sure, go ahead.
Because we all know you own Defensive Tactics, and
That's right.
I think people need to understand this universal background check is applicable to any type of sale from a federal licensed dealer.
That's
whether
right.
you go to Walmart, whether you go to a gun shop, a pawn shop, anyone, they're going to run that report on you, or that background check, and it goes to NIC, the NICS, National Instant Criminal Background Check. And I'm going 1,000 miles a minute because we had some of these conversations before, but one of those people prohibited, and what would be the red flag for you as a gun store owner? Citizen A, you gave us the example, goes to a store, and he had a previous relationship, that a word you used, there was high emotions involved with it, right? And he got into a tiff with his spouse and hit her, and he got arrested. The process thereafter is the police take him in. He's registered as a what? What's the process after he gets prosecuted? There's a case, and it becomes national information.
Yeah, like say you get convicted of a felony or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So once you are basically a prohibited purchaser of a firearm, you go into the NICS database. However you get in there, could be because you're a convicted felon, could be because you've renounced your citizenship.
Okay.
Could be because you have been involuntarily committed to a mental hospital. Whatever gets you into the system, you're in the system. And then when I plug in your social security number into that system, very quickly, within usually about 120 seconds,
right, just like that,
the system comes back and says good or no good. Right?
Okay.
And that's how it is for a sale going through a gun shop.
Right. Okay.
Now, again, this started in 1993. Before that, it wasn't required, but in 1993, that happened, and even the Supreme Court, when addressing restrictions, and these, even the initial background check system was challenged. The courts have all said that does not impose any type of infringement on the Second Amendment, right? Because the federal government has the right. The Second Amendment doesn't say anyone can own a gun. It says it can be regulated, well regulated. And one of the regulations that the federal government has imposed is it's created this list, and I've just read it, found it 1922G, that says you can't own a gun if you're one of these types of people, right?
Right. Okay.
So, so if I'm a convicted felon, I can't walk into a gun shop and buy a gun. But I can go to a private party seller who's selling a gun and buy a gun from them. That's totally, it's not legal per se, because the convicted felon is not supposed to be purchasing a firearm, but there's nobody there to stop that from happening.
That's right, yeah.
If that felon comes into the gun shop and he tries to buy a gun and we run his background check, the government says, no, you can't do that transaction. And then I cannot, as a gun dealer, sell him the gun. Right? So there's the ability for the government to weigh in on whether this person should be allowed to have a firearm when you go to a gun shop, but this does not exist between two private party sellers.
At your store, it comes down yes or no.
That's all it says. It doesn't say no because he's a felon or no because he's revoked his citizenship. It just says yes or no.
How much does it cost?
$2.
$2, okay.
$2 for the background check. Most gun shops charge a little bit more because we have to store the records for 20 years and all that. But I would say there's not too many gun shops, at least in Virginia, that are charging more than $10.
Okay.
But the actual true cost to do a background check is $2 to the state charges the gun shop to do that transaction. And that's always passed on to the buyer. The buyer has to pay for that. So when we're talking about what is and what is not, intrusive on the Second Amendment, that has been held to not be intrusive from when you're going to a federal firearms dealer. So the question now is can the states require private parties to do this? Now, this is an interesting conversation to have because the federal government hasn't made this a rule, right? So because the federal government has failed to act, the states are taking it amongst themselves to to make decisions for how transactions are going to occur in those states. And what we have to really scrutinize here is, can the states do that? Can the states make their own regulations? Well, let's flip over to who's done it. So the states that have done it are pretty comprehensive. I think the last time I looked, there are about 13 states in the United States that have required what are called universal background checks on sellers and buyers of firearms in private party transactions. Now, not mistakenly, pretty much all of those states have been very liberal-leaning states. And so when we hear universal background checks, we are initially offended as gun owners by the states that have done it. So New Jersey, New York, California, of course, Colorado, Connecticut, Vermont, Washington, D.C. These are all super liberal states. And so when we see gun regulations happening in these super liberal states, conservatives and other people initially be like, well, if that's their idea, that shouldn't be our idea. You just by default, because these states are, very restrictive and maybe have gone extremely restrictive in a number of ways. But here's one thing for everybody in the Facebook world to understand. These states that have passed universal background checks, they've been challenged in courts, and there has not been one single court case that has found that requiring private party universal background checks violates the Second Amendment.
Okay.
Not one.
Right.
So, all these states have passed these rules,
yes.
And there has not been a single state that has said, a court that has said, hey, these are violations of the rules. So that's something important to know because, in a lot of my videos, I talk about, what are the potential challenges that, we can expect and, what can we look at? And in every one of these situations that involve universal background checks, there's not been a single court challenge that has actually worked.
Right.
So what the states do in Colorado and Connecticut and all of that is they basically say, if I want to sell you a gun, Mark, as a private party person, you have to go to a gun shop to effectuate the background check.
That's correct, yes. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's all there is to it. Now, the background check is going to, cost a little bit of money, and, the gun shop is not going to want to necessarily do this for free. And so there might be a little bit of a charge, from the background check side of things, from this, but it's not going to be something that is going to, evaporate the private party market. For us at my gun shop, when you can voluntarily want to do this, by the way. And so if you, under the current law, so if you voluntarily want to bring somebody in and go through the gun shop, it's basically considered a transfer. And typically, most gun shops, including ours, charge about $25 to do a transfer. Okay, and so you're probably going to see something like that in the in the future when these rules pass. Oh well, he sells guns, so of course he's in front of and for universal background checks because he's going to make a fee. I mean, trust me. We have to store the paperwork for 20 years. There's liability. We don't run the background check correctly. We can be criminally prosecuted. I mean, nobody's pushing for universal background checks to make money. Right. From the gun shop side of things. So please let that evaporate from your vocabulary. This is not me as a gun shop owner saying we should have universal background checks in Virginia. so that we can make more revenue at the gun shop. That's crazy. And you know, that is a very, very minimal amount of money that will come in. But what it will do is it will require private party sellers, when they want to sell or transfer their firearms to someone else, for that new buyer or that new owner to have to go through a background check, and for the state to say whether or not that person can own the gun.
Yeah. What do you foresee if in Virginia that happens? The example you gave, if you wanted to sell me a gun and you have some concern, well, you're a lawyer, of course, but average Joe and average Mark say, hey man, I just want to make sure this is clean. My name doesn't come up. Your name doesn't come up. I told you the gun is clean. So let's agree to go down to the gun shop. What would the state of Virginia, if I'd said, hey man, I don't want to do it, what would the state of Virginia require me in this instance to implement this background check?
Well, I think what's going to happen is first of all, universal background checks are going to become the law in Virginia. It's not an if. The Governor Northam has promised, now that he has full control of the legislature, it's going to happen. What's going to happen is it would be a criminal penalty for you as a seller to sell a firearm without following the law. If it follows how the other states are. Now, of course, we haven't seen what Virginia is going to do, but there would be a punishment to you as the seller and the buyer to make this transaction.
Okay.
Currently, it is only a punishment to the buyer to purchase a firearm if they're prohibited. Mm-hmm. So as the seller, if you sell a gun to a convicted felon and you don't know that he's a convicted felon because you didn't ask and you didn't talk about it,
right.
There's no penalty to you for doing that. It would be a felony to the buyer under the federal rules for him to purchase a firearm.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So he would be committing a felony by doing that. What universal background checks are going to do is they're going to impose on the sellers that you'll have a penalty as well. Mm-hmm. And so if you and this subsequent buyer do a transaction after universal background checks become a rule, then you will face whatever the legislature is going to determine to be the punishment, whether that's a misdemeanor, whether that's a felony, whether it's a fine, whether there's these things. And so obviously, there's not going to be any real way to know if you sell a gun to somebody else because we don't have a registry in Virginia. Virginia doesn't know how many guns you have and what you're doing with them. But what happens is that if you do make a transaction after the law goes into effect and you don't go through the background check standpoints, and then that gun eventually gets used in a crime, and then the police figure out how this person got it, and they backtrack it to you, then that's how you're going to get wrapped up in the enforcement side of the penalty. And so here's a couple things to think about, and then you can tell me what your research has found. So there's a lot of the times when one side of the equation wants to make their point, they like to use statistics. And remember how we talked about that on one of our shows where, there's
yes, we did.
One person, mass shootings occur, 90% in gun-free zones, and another study said that they only occur 30% in gun-free zones, and then it got down to what's the definition of a gun-free zone and all of that. Well, here's a statistic, and I'm sure that this statistic has been taken to support the liberal side of the equation as much as possible. But the statistic is that 80% of all firearms that were acquired for criminal purposes were obtained through transfers of unlicensed sellers, and 96% of inmates convicted of gun offenses who were already prohibited from possessing a firearm got it from an unlicensed seller. So they're saying that almost all crimes that occurred with guns occur because the people that obtain the guns obtain them through private party sellers. Mm-hmm. And that's something very, very, whether those statistics are right or wrong, I think that you can probably say that a high probability of people who commit crimes with guns are purchasing the guns through private party transactions.
And illegal.
Illegally.
Yes.
Well, it's legal now to do it that way. Well, it would be illegal because they would be prohibited. Right. But the seller isn't breaking any laws, but the buyers are. And so anyway, so if you're interested in reading about this woman named Catherine Vitz, John Vernick, and Daniel Webster created a paper back in 2013 that said the legal status and source of offenders, firearms in states with the least stringent criteria for gun ownership, from the Injury Prevention Magazine 19, number 1, 2013. Now, I am 99% sure that those numbers are skewed very favorably to the liberal side of the equation. But when the numbers are that high, there has to be some truth to the numbers that probably more than not, people who are committing crimes with guns are getting them without getting the guns lawfully from the gun shop.
Sure, yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that people don't go into gun shops and buy guns and commit crimes. Not saying that. But if a high percentage of people are getting those guns private party because the government can't weigh in on whether that person can buy a gun, then that is something that we have to think about. Would a universal background check stop those transactions? In every case, yes, they would. If you're a prohibited person and you're trying to buy a gun from a private party and you go to a gun shop and they run your background check and they say that sale can't happen, that will prevent the seller from transferring the gun unless the seller wants to do it illegally.
That's factual. I did read some data also that says that can be a contributing factor to lessening gun violence. So there's some, as you said, if it's that high, there's some substance to it with regards to how guns get on the street. And one of the hot topics, so to speak, when it comes to this is the gun shows. Everyone always seems to point to that as a way that these, if I could say, illegal transactions occur, but they may not necessarily be illegal, I don't know. But, and they always seem to occur after there's been a mass shooting. The numbers go up, the numbers go down, depending upon what side of the equation you are, what you believe, whether they instant background checks could have prevented it or not. And I'm skipping ahead, going around bit to bit, but another component we talked about on this show is the mental health component. So in that data you provided, those who do have mental health issues, if by chance they were to go to a gun store and purchase or wherever, they would be prohibited, so it would be a contributing factor to lessening gun violence. But they don't do that. They go get a gun wherever they can.
Well, and I think that's extremely important to understand. What you're saying hits the nail on the head. If I am a prohibited person from purchasing a firearm, currently right this minute, I can go buy a gun legally, even though I'm breaking the law, but I can get a gun in a normal transaction without going to a gang member and having to buy it out of the back of somebody's car. I can go to a gun show or I can go online and look at people that are selling guns online. And as long as they're a resident of the same state I am, me and that seller can buy can do this transaction. And that is how many people who are prohibited get around the system. So I guess my first question for the people on Facebook, and I'm already seeing some of the negative comments, and that's fine, is if you have to purchase a gun from a gun shop and you have to go through a background check, which we've all accepted that's how it is, okay? The courts have accepted that's how it is. When it's time to dispose of that gun, why does the seller and the buyer not have to go through the same type of a background procedure? Why not? Because the gun is obviously something that is dangerous in and of itself. It's a weapon, and because it's dangerous, the government gets to weigh in on who can buy it. I mean, a 9-year-old can't go into a gun shop and buy a gun. Somebody who's an illegal alien can't go into a gun shop to buy a gun. The government wants to weigh in on who can own this type of an asset. And so if the government gets to weigh in on the first purchaser, why doesn't the government get to weigh in on the second purchaser and the third purchaser and the transfers and all of that? Why doesn't the government get to do that? And how does that offend the Constitution for that, for these laws to, to kick in. We talked about it on one of our radio shows. It protects the integrity of the system.
That's exactly. I like the way you phrase it, the integrity of the system. That's very key.
Because without it, what's the point of having the first
layer, so to speak?
First layer.
Yeah. Okay.
Because if I'm a non-felon, I can buy a gun. I can go into a gun shop and buy a gun, and then I have it, and I can just sell it to anybody, and anybody may be prohibited or not prohibited. What's the point? You're just basically making the people who purchase new guns go through the background check. But then the used guns have no the government has no ability to weigh in on whether or not that person should be allowed to own a firearm. Now, we've talked about this a lot, and these laws are going to come. Whether you like them or not, these laws are going to come.
Yeah.
Are there challenges that we can make to the laws? Well, like I've said, in all of the 13 or 14 states where the universal gun laws are in place, there's not been a single court challenge that has overturned it. Basically, for the court to overturn a governmental restriction, we've talked about the Heller case, and we've talked about what the Supreme Court said. There would have to be an offensive rule that the government would impose upon the citizens that would offend the ability for our right to purchase and possess firearms. All right, that's the rule.
Yeah. What would you see if you were theoretically, or what would you see would offend that right?
Maybe something that would say only landowners could own firearms. Okay. So that could be an example. Okay. So you have to be a landowner, you have to own real estate in Virginia before you could buy a gun.
Okay, I got you.
And if that were the rule, then somebody would come up and say that, just because I rent an apartment doesn't mean I shouldn't be allowed to own a firearm. Okay, that would be a good example. But to tell somebody that you have to go to a gun shop and you have to go through a background check that will take about 2 minutes for most people to let the government weigh in on that, the courts are not going to find that violates the ability of somebody to own and possess a firearm. And they haven't in all of these other states. Mm-hmm. Now, the question is really going to be, why haven't we seen this happen more on the federal level? Why hasn't the federal government weighed in on doing this? And the real truth of this is that basically you have two different people in Washington D.C. right now. You have Republicans who want no additional rules and regulations on any kind of gun transactions because there's already hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And then you have people on the Democrat side that think that we should really, really be aggressive and extremely restrictive on firearms. And that leads to the idea of this is the beginning of how Nazi Germany started confiscating firearms and all of that. And so there's these two sides, and they're so away from each other that they can't come together and have any type of a conversation about what is right or wrong. So because of that, the government has not been able, federal government has not been able to force, these types of regulations on a national level. But what you're seeing is in states like Colorado and now Virginia that are flipping all blue at the state level. The states are then, when they become all blue, they're able to push these policies on the individuals of the state, and that's how the states are coming to address the failure of Washington D.C. to come up with some kind of comprehensive national gun regulations. Keep in mind, there's not been a major comprehensive gun regulation since 1993. I mean. Yeah. Nothing major has really come out of Washington D.C. I mean, there's been a few laws here and there, and there was the assault weapons ban that came and went, and but there's not been anything substantial that's changed, and that's generally because one side says no more, and the other side just keeps pushing, and they won't talk. So the states are doing this. So the states that are turning blue are moving these laws on the books.
Right. And one side of the folks who are in support of more restrictive gun measures, somehow drawing what I might say respectfully is a false parallel, thinking that is going to reduce crime. It's been nominal from a number of different studies I've read, Rand Corporation and others. But you mentioned something about offending the constitutional right, and this may be fitting into what you were saying. With regards to those who are opposed, rights groups opposed to background checks. Gun rights groups such as the National Rifle Association and National Shooting Sports Foundation opposed universal background check proposals. Opponents of universal background checks argue that existing gun laws are sufficient, that the government does not prosecute enough of the attempted ineligible buyers who are turned away by the current system, that background checks are an invasion of privacy, and that transfer might be defined too broadly. Opponents also maintain that universal background checks would not stop crime. And they also assert that the only way to properly enforce a universal system would be to require a registration database. You mentioned that database, the registry. Gun rights advocates and authors such as John Lott argues that universal background checks prevent poor Americans from acquiring guns. Lott also said that in December 2015, background checks added an effective cost of $80 in New York, $60 in Washington State, or $200 in Washington, D.C. to transferring a firearm. Lott argues that universal background checks are an effective tax on guns and can prevent less affluent Americans from purchasing them, and that this disproportionately affects poor minority communities who live in high crime areas. Some local counties have adopted Second Amendment sanctuary resolutions in opposition to universal background checks. So the cost, the taxation, could those be used as a legal strategy?
That could be an argument, but at least unless they change the price of background checks in Richmond, they only cost us $2. Okay. And so if you're buying a gun from a dealer, and they're charging you, substantially more than $2, that's just profit to the gun shop. We're going to, if you were to come into our shop and do two private parties would come in and do a transaction, we're going to charge that as what we call a transfer fee, which is $25 plus the state background check, so $27, and that's it. I don't know that with shops like mine, and there's lots of us out there, I don't know that too many people are going to be able to say, because there's a $27 fee that's added on to the private party sale, that is going to cause poor people not to be able to purchase firearms. Yeah. Now, maybe if it was a $200 thing, that could maybe be an argument. That could be an argument. Or maybe if it was even a $150 or $100 thing. But I think $27, which is what we would charge, and I know a lot of shops charge the same fee, that is where it is. The market kind of decides that. Now, if you come into our shop and you just buy a gun from us, we just charge the $2 because the profit we make is on the gun, not on the doing the background paperwork. But when two private parties come in and they say, hey, we want to do this transaction, and I have to store the paperwork and I have to do the background check and my employees have to process all that, we're going to charge a small premium to do that. Yeah. So $27. I think that would be a hard argument to make. Yeah. Now, the next point on what you just said is invasion of privacy. Wow. I mean, that's really super, super broad. Okay. Right. If I want to buy a gun from a private party seller, how does that invade my privacy to let the government decide whether I can buy that gun, right? I mean, that when the initial purchaser had to go in and do that same background check. I mean, we're not talking about, knives. We're not talking about baseball bats. We're talking about firearms. And, there's lots of ways to kill people, but, the most common way people will use is firearms. And so how does letting the government weigh in on whether you as the purchaser should be able to own and possess a firearm, how does that offend any privacy laws It's not going to lead to a national registry. It basically is going to be the law, and if people want to break the law, they're going to break the law. But it's going to say if you want to sell your gun, we're going to ensure you go through the steps. Now, going back to what we first started with the ATF, the Best Practices Transfers Act, there's a section here that says transaction alternatives for private sellers. And it says here, for private sellers wanting assurance that other individuals are not prohibited from possessing firearms, we encourage you to go to a federal firearms dealer to do the background check. And that will allow the federal firearms dealer to make sure that the person is a resident of your state and go through the background check. And so the ATF encourages people to do this, even though it's not required. And so even today, if you don't follow these rules as the seller, you're not going to be in trouble for selling to a felon. But what the states are saying is that because the sellers are not voluntarily, going in and doing this at a gun shop, then we're going to require that. Now, we did get a Facebook question on here, and it says, do you have to go to a gun shop to do a background check? Currently, the answer to that is yes. The reason that you have to go to do the background check at the gun shop is that all the forms that are required to do the background check are on file with a gun shop. So there's a federal form and then there's a state form, and these things are included in the paperwork that we have. You're not allowed to go to a police department or something like that to conduct the transaction. So you have to go to what's called a federal firearm licensed dealer to do a federal background check. There's no other entities out there that do this except for what are called FFLs. So let's see what else. We've got a couple of other questions here. All right. So Mr. Noel, I see your question about the magazine ban. I'll talk about that right at the end of the show. That's a little off topic, but I will talk about that here once we get through the rest of the universal background check stuff. So I'll tell you generally a story about a guy that was put into a mental hospital, and he came out of the mental hospital and he went and purchased a gun. All right. I mean, I know that to be a fact. I know that is a situation that has occurred where I have firsthand knowledge of that. Now, that person got that gun legally. I say legally, he wasn't allowed to have the gun, but he purchased that gun legally from a seller because the seller had no way of knowing that person had ever been put in a mental hospital. Right. And so without going through the background check process, there's this huge loophole in the law that allows purchasers to purchase firearms without the government weighing in on that. And when you went and bought the gun initially, the gun new or from the dealer, you had to go through the background check.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
If you don't require the next person to go through the background check, then we're creating a big gap between the integrity of what's the purpose of the first layer. The layer should go from the first layer to the last layer. Anybody who gets a firearm should have a background check along the way. It doesn't cost much. It doesn't take much time. It doesn't interfere in somebody's constitutional rights to own or possess firearms, except to the extent that if you can't own a firearm, the government can come in and say, no, you can't do that transaction.
That's it. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
And that's where you are.
Yeah.
And that's what the concept generally says. There is no way you can look at somebody and tell me if they have been convicted of a domestic violence case.
That's right.
There's just no way to know that. Right. There's no way as a seller of a gun you would be able to do that. Now, you're always going to hear these things called the gun show loophole.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, the reason it's called that is that most private party transactions occur at gun shows. Now, it doesn't mean all of them, but usually what happens is you go to a gun show, you're walking around with a gun on your back, and it says, this sign says $400 for a gun, and somebody walks up to you and says, here's $400, and the transaction happens right there. Now, if you go to a gun show and you purchase a gun from a dealer at a gun show, you'll have to go through the federal background checks, right? But these private party transactions that occur a lot of the times occur at gun shows, which is why they call it the gun show loophole. But it's really not a gun show loophole. It's a private party loophole. It's a private party transaction loophole between two consenting adults in one person selling a gun to another without letting the government weigh in on whether that purchaser should be able to buy it.
Yeah, thanks for making that distinction. I think, as I stated, people go after the gun shows as a source, but it is, in fact, not the organizers or producers or promoters. It's that individual and the individual making a transaction, which just happens to be at this mall or coliseum or whatever.
Right.
Right. People they just want to. Well, you got to go after the gun shows, man. No, it's the individuals making the transaction.
That's right. It is the individuals who will make those decisions, who will decide whether or not you can purchase or possess a firearm. Now, having heard all of this, let me take the other side of the equation. 99% of people who purchase firearms legally do not commit crimes.
That's right. That's right.
And so the appetite for lawful gun owners is nauseating whenever somebody goes out and they commit a crime, and then it's like, we need to punish the lawful gun owners, when 99% of the people don't commit crimes with those. Somebody goes out with an AR-15 and they shoot up a school. We need to punish everybody with AR-15s. We need to punish the gun. We need to punish the lawful owners. We need to punish these people, when 99% of the people who buy guns and have guns legally do not commit crimes. That is why the right has a very hard time with anybody saying, hey, we need more gun rules, we need more gun laws. The right has a very legitimate point to make here, and my counterpoint to that is that the majority of gun crimes that happen occur with people that were prohibited from owning and possessing the firearm to begin with.
That's right.
Now, that's an important distinction to know. When you look at these kids that go to schools and they shoot their schools up, like it just happened in California, the 16-year-old boy who shot the school up, right? Yeah. He wasn't allowed to have that gun to begin with.
Right.
So there's no law that can change that. There's no law that can prevent somebody who's illegally getting a gun and illegally going to use the gun. There's no law that can prevent that. What universal background checks do is they protect the integrity of the system. It brings legitimacy to a system so that we as lawful gun owners can say, hey, we already have background checks. We don't need more rules. But when we have a background check system that allows private parties to just sell it to whoever they want, that system is fundamentally flawed, and it literally hurts the people who are advocating that we shouldn't have more gun rules, because the system is broken. It's glaringly broken in the extent that if I have a mental health commitment hearing, or I have a convicted felon, or I'm an assault and batterer in a domestic situation, I can still go get a gun from a consensual seller who's not breaking the law for me to sell it. Now, I can always go on the black market. I can always go into the back of a trunk of somebody and purchase a gun, but from a gang member. But when I do that, there's a good chance that the police may apprehend me, right? But at a gun show, there's police everywhere, and these transactions are occurring in public because they're lawful. And that's why universal background checks need to apply to all the transactions, because it protects the integrity of the system. It may or may not prevent more shootings. It may or may not prevent mass shootings. It may or may not prevent the regulations of somebody going and shooting up Building 2 at Virginia Beach. It may not prevent any of that stuff, but what it will do is it will say, anybody who gets a gun has to go through a background check.
Yes.
And that has to be eventually a good thing.
That's
for
right.
everybody involved.
Yeah. Here's a little anecdotal story. I remember reporting when we were doing this Sandy Hook Elementary, and I do remember some folks from the NRA and others, and I do believe a lot about the NRA. It has its position, it has some good, and it has some things that, I think are just becoming, that don't address the immediate issue of reducing violence. It's just more for support of the Second Amendment. I wholeheartedly agree on that, but there is a middle road here and an awareness. In the Sandy Hook Elementary School, this kid took his mom's firearms, as I recall. He got them, took them out of the house, and that's how he got to the school. Well, the NRA talks about proper storage and safekeeping of firearms. You never hear that in the news topics. It never makes either the liberal or conservative liberal, it never makes anyone's news headlines. That was the crux of the matter. How did he get access to those guns?
That's right. Well, I'm sure there's probably some law in California that addresses that, and I'm sure those parents will probably be prosecuted for that 16-year-old having access. Look, if you have a firearm and you have kids in your house, you got to have your guns locked up. I mean, that's the bottom line. I mean, you got to have them inaccessible from your children, because if your children get a hold of them, then there's going to be consequences, possible. And I have no problem with parents having criminal consequences if their kids get a hold of a gun. I mean, these are guns, okay?
Right. Okay.
These are serious things, and I am 100% in support of us being able to own them. But I'm also 100% in support of punishing people that don't make sure they don't fall in the hands of a prohibited person. And a prohibited person is a child. Mm-hmm. A child is a prohibited person. A 15-year-old can't walk around town with a Glock 19. Right. All right. Let's get to the questions and comments. We're blowing through the hour, so let's talk about. Let's see here. I did get a question about the magazine ban, so we still do not know the answer to that question. The magazine ban is likely coming, and the magazine ban basically says that if you own a firearm that has a capacity of over more than a certain amount, that is going to be illegal. Not the gun per se, but the magazine part of the gun.
Okay.
So don't know if there's going to be grandfather clauses in that. We're still waiting for Richmond to decide. That probably will get decided in the next 2 months. We're going to know those rules pretty quickly. And we don't know if there's going to be a grandfather clause, meaning that if you have a gun with a higher magazine, you'll still be allowed to own it. So these are things we've got to watch, all right? But almost every firearm that you can buy in today's market that has a 15 or 20 magazine capacity, you can buy a smaller magazine for them. So if the law passes and there is no grandfather clause, then the quick fix is going to be to get rid of the magazine, not the gun. Just order a magazine that has a smaller capacity, and so that's going to be generally what the workaround is going to be under those rules. Hopefully there'll be a grandfather clause. Without a grandfather clause, it's probably highly court challengeable. With a grandfather clause, lots of states have done it, and with grandfather clauses, it's going to be difficult to challenge.
January 2020, right around the corner.
That's when
it is going to be a hot month.
It is going to be a hot month.
January cold hot. I made a joke.
We're going to be here broadcasting daily, probably, on what's happening in Richmond to understand that. All right, so that is where we are. I'm going to leave it at that. I hope that what you heard helps you understand whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, whether you are for the Second Amendment, or you think there shouldn't even be a Second Amendment. The universal background check rules are coming. And I guess if you're trying to make some lemonade out of the lemons, if you see it as a bad thing, the good side of the equation is that it's not extremely expensive to take your transaction to a gun shop.
Right, makes sense.
It's not going to interfere with you being able to sell guns still if you're a private seller, and you're just going to have to involve a federal firearm licensed dealer in the transaction, and that small fee, you can pass that on to the buyer to pay, and the buyer would be required to purchase that. And that's and if that saves lives, if that does not save lives, the point generally is that it will protect the integrity of how the system works, and that can only eventually become a good thing.
Right. And that also applies, by the way, that whether I'm selling you my grandfather's 16 gauge shotgun from 1970 something, if it's a collector's item or whatever, it still applies.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, one person said, well, what if you have 10 guns and you're handing them down to your grandkid? Then you'd have to pay $27 per gun. The way that the federal forms work is you can do 4 firearms per transaction.
Okay.
So we generally would charge $27 to do up to 4. And so if you had 10, you'd have to do a little bit more, but it would just be one background check. We'd just have to do more paperwork. So you can transfer more than one firearm in like an inheritance situation. So anyway, I hope that helps. My name's Tim Anderson. I'll watch your comments. Go ahead and call me a snowflake and a liberal and all that, but I'm one of the strongest Second Amendment people out there. This is happening. You're not going to get a say on whether it's not going to happen. It is going to happen. So hopefully this brings some perspective of what it's going to look like, and it's not going to really be as bad as the NRA and other saber rattlers are going to make it sound. There are bad things coming out of Richmond, and we've talked about that, but this is not going to be one that's going to end life as we know it for private party sales.
Appreciate it. Catch you next time.